There was a moment, deep into stoppage time, when an entire nation believed it had witnessed something historic. A goal, the ball in the net, players sprinting toward the corner flag, a bench emptying onto the pitch. The kind of release that only comes after 90-plus minutes of tension, when a result that could change everything suddenly feels real. And then the flag went up. The review began, and in the space of about 90 seconds, that moment of pure joy turned into something else entirely. This is the story of what happened to Iran in the closing stages of their group stage finale against Egypt at the 2026 World Cup. But it's also the story of something much bigger than one disallowed goal. Because for Iran's players, their federation, and their supporters, this moment landed on top of weeks of frustration that had already been building since before the tournament even kicked off. So, what actually happened on the pitch? And why does this particular controversy feel like the breaking point for a team that's been dealing with far more than football for weeks? Let's start with the match itself, because the drama here genuinely earns its description. Iran needed a win against Egypt to finish second in Group G. Both sides had reasons to push hard. Egypt, under head coach Hossam Hassan, needed at minimum a draw to secure their own path into the knockout stage. The match had been tight throughout, with neither side able to find a breakthrough that would settle things definitively. Then, in the 94th minute, with the clock running down and a draw looking like the inevitable outcome, Iran's number 4 found the net. The stadium reaction was immediate. Iranian players streamed toward the goal in celebration. For a few seconds, it looked like Iran had completed exactly the kind of late dramatic turnaround that World Cups are remembered for. Then came the review. Referee Simon Marciniak, after consulting VAR, delivered the verdict that changed everything. Number 4 of Iran scored a goal from an offside position. Final decision, offside. The goal was ruled out. Egypt held on for a 1-1 draw, a result that sent them through to the round of 32 alongside Belgium, while Iran's hopes of finishing second in the group collapsed in that same instant. The margin involved was razor thin. Iran's defender was deemed offside by the slightest of margins, with the goalkeeper positioned well advanced of the play at the moment the ball was played forward. World Feed commentator Conor McNamara captured the swing of emotion in real time, describing it simply as, "What drama?" While co-commentator Matt Holland noted there was nothing in the margin that determined the call either way. On the Egyptian side, the moment carried its own intensity. Head coach Hossam Hassan was reportedly seen on his knees in apparent prayer before the goal was officially ruled out. A small but telling detail of just how much hung in the balance for both teams in that 94th minute sequence. Here's where things get interesting, because this VAR decision didn't happen in a vacuum. For Iran specifically, it landed at the end of a tournament buildup that had already tested the squad in ways no other nation at this World Cup has had to deal with. Let's back up to where this all started. Iran's path to the United States for this tournament was never going to be straightforward, and the Federation knew that well before a ball was kicked. The relationship between Iran and the host nation created layers of logistical complexity that other qualified teams simply didn't face. Iran's national team ultimately had to base its World Cup training camp not on American soil, but in Mexico, shifting their entire operational setup across an international border for the duration of the tournament. The travel restrictions imposed on the team were severe, even by the standards of a politically complicated hosting situation. Initial reports indicated the team would be permitted to enter the United States only a very short window before each of their scheduled matches, forcing the squad to cross back and forth rather than settling into any kind of normal pre-match rhythm. That's a massive disruption to anything resembling standard tournament preparation, where teams typically want days, not hours, to acclimate, train, and recover between travel and competition. There was eventually some relief on this front. On June 23rd, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security announced it would ease the travel restrictions specifically for Iran's national team, allowing the squad to enter the United States 2 days before their scheduled match against Egypt, an improvement compared to the stricter timeline they had been operating under for their earlier group matches. But even with that adjustment, 2 days is still a dramatically compressed preparation window compared to what other nations were able to build into their tournament schedules. This matters because rest and recovery time isn't a luxury at the highest level of football. It's a competitive necessity. Players who are managing constant border crossings, unpredictable entry timelines, and condensed preparation windows are operating with a clear disadvantage compared to opponents who can settle into one location and focus purely on tactics, recovery, and match preparation. When you're talking about margins as small as the offside call that disallowed Iran's goal against Egypt, every bit of preparation time matters. But the travel and basing situation wasn't the only friction point for Iran heading into this tournament. The federation also reported that its official ticket allocation for the tournament had been revoked just days before the competition began. An issue that left Iranian supporters who had already finalized flights, accommodation, and travel plans suddenly unable to attend matches involving their own national team. For a fan base that had been planning for this tournament for years, having that access pulled away in the final stretch represented a significant and very public source of frustration, separate entirely from anything happening on the pitch. There were also individual visa concerns raised directly by Iranian players themselves. Forwards Mehdi Taremi and Alireza Jahanbakhsh both spoke publicly about delays and restrictions tied to entry into the United States, describing how the uncertainty created additional logistical difficulty for the squad in the lead-up to games. When players at this level are using their own voices to flag these issues, it tells you the disruption wasn't a minor inconvenience easily absorbed into the background of tournament life. It was something the squad felt directly, match after match. There's also a deeply human layer to Iran's tournament that adds real weight to everything else going on around the team. When the players arrived for their matches, they wore pins bearing the number 168, a tribute representing the number of victims from the 2026 Manab school attack back home. It's a detail that puts the football itself into a different kind of perspective, a reminder that these players were carrying something far heavier than 3 points in a group stage table while they navigated travel restrictions, ticketing issues, and now a contentious officiating decision in the final minute of their group campaign. So, when the VAR called disallowed that 94th minute goal against Egypt, it didn't land as an isolated football moment for Iran. It landed on top of all of this. The accumulation of frustrations around access, travel, fairness, and basic tournament conditions created an environment where a tight offside call, the kind that happens at every World Cup and that VAR exists specifically to adjudicate, became something that felt to many inside Iran's camp like the latest entry on a much longer list. Now, it's worth pausing here on what we actually know about the call itself, because the offside decision deserves to be evaluated on its own technical merits, separate from everything else surrounding Iran's tournament. VAR offside reviews are determined using precise positional data, and officials at this level are working from frame-by-frame video analysis specifically designed to catch margins invisible to the naked eye in real time. The call against Iran's number 4 was, by every account from those watching the broadcast, an extraordinarily fine one. Both commentators on the world feed acknowledged there was barely anything separating an onside and offside position. That's exactly the kind of call VAR was introduced to handle, even when the outcome feels brutal for the team on the wrong side of the decision. This is where things become genuinely complicated for anyone trying to fairly assess what happened. The technology functioned as intended. The officiating process followed the same protocol that's been applied across every match at this tournament, and yet the outcome arrived at the worst possible moment for a team that had already absorbed an unusually difficult set of circumstances just to be competing in the first place. This matters because it raises a broader question that extends well beyond this single match. When a team faces compounding disadvantages, compressed preparation windows, disrupted fan support, individual visa concerns raised by their own players, does a perfectly correct officiating decisions still feel different to that team and its supporters than it would to a side that experienced a smoother tournament build-up? There's no official answer to that question, and FIFA's officiating standards don't and shouldn't account for off-pitch circumstances when applying offside law. But emotionally and from a fan perspective, context shapes how decisions are received, even when the decision itself was technically sound. For Iran specifically, the result means their World Cup campaign in the group stage ends with a draw against Egypt, finishing in a position that sends them out of second place in Group G. Egypt advances to face Australia in the round of 32. For Iran's players, coaching staff, and supporters, it's an outcome that will likely be remembered less for the football itself and more for the accumulation of obstacles that defined their entire tournament experience from start to finish. The bigger picture here connects to something that's been a running theme throughout this entire World Cup. FIFA has promoted this tournament under the banner of football uniting the world, presenting it as a global symbol of connection and shared celebration. But for a number of nations, including Iran, the lived experience of actually competing has involved navigating political tension, visa uncertainty, security concerns, and logistical hurdles that other qualified teams simply haven't had to manage in the same way. Some analysts following the tournament closely have pointed to exactly this kind of disconnect, arguing that while FIFA's messaging continues to emphasize unity, the practical reality for certain federations has highlighted division and unequal access rather than erasing it. Iran's tournament, from the training camp relocation to Mexico to the revoked ticket allocation to the individual visa concerns raised by their own players, fits squarely into that broader pattern. What happens from here for Iranian football remains to be seen. The federation has not been shy about raising concerns publicly when it felt conditions were unfair, and there's no reason to expect that pattern to change now that the group stage has concluded under these circumstances. Whether any formal review or appeal follows the Egypt result is something that will likely develop in the days ahead. What's clear right now is that Iran leaves this World Cup with a story that extends well past one offside call. It's a story about a team that competed under conditions no other nation at this tournament had to face, that lost ticket access for its own supporters days before kickoff, that carried genuine grief from home onto the pitch, and that saw its tournament end on the finest of margins in a match it believed for about 90 seconds it had won. What do you think? Was the VAR call against Iran the correct decision purely on the offside law, even with everything else this team had to navigate to even be standing on that pitch? And does the broader context of a team's tournament experience change how fans should process a result like this one? Let me know in the comments. This is exactly the kind of moment that shows how much more goes into a World Cup campaign than what happens between the two 18-yard boxes. If you want to keep following how the rest of this tournament unfolds, go ahead and subscribe. This story is still developing, and as always, football never stays quiet for long. And speaking of football never staying quiet, let's actually dig deeper into what this moment represents, not just for Iran, but for the future of how World Cups are hosted, how political realities intersect with sport, and what FIFA's responsibility actually looks like when the tournament is over and the cameras move on. Because here's something that doesn't get discussed enough. Iran is not the first team at a politically complicated World Cup to deal with this kind of asymmetry, and if the pattern holds, they almost certainly won't be the last. Let's talk about what unequal preparation actually costs a team at this level, because I think most people watching from home significantly underestimate how compounding these disadvantages really are. When we talk about elite international football, we're talking about a sport where a player's physical peak on match day is the result of extremely precise planning. Sleep schedules, training loads, travel windows, nutrition timing, tactical walkthroughs, everything is calibrated to a specific kickoff time. Top-level coaching staff work backward from that moment days in advance. Now imagine you're Iran's head coach. Your squad is based in Mexico. You have a 2-day entry window into the United States before your match. That means in those 48 hours, your players are traveling internationally, going through border processing, settling into a new environment, running a training session or two, and then playing a match where every single detail matters. Compare that to, say, Belgium, who were in the same group. No travel restrictions, no basing situation outside the host country, full tournament facilities, standard preparation windows, everything by the book. The question isn't whether Iran's players were professional enough to handle it. They clearly were. They competed hard. They pushed Egypt to a draw. They were 90 seconds away from a result that would have sent them through. The question is whether it's acceptable in a tournament that FIFA describes as the pinnacle of global football for some teams to be competing with one hand tied behind their back before a single minute of football is played. And here's where it gets complicated, because FIFA exists at the intersection of sport and geopolitics in a way that no other sporting body quite does. When you award a World Cup to a host nation, you're making a statement about what that country represents on the world stage. You're bringing 32 nations into that space. and some of those nations have complicated, sometimes hostile political relationships with the host. That's not a new problem. It's been a feature of World Cups for decades. But the 2026 edition, hosted across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, amplified it in specific ways because of the unique position the United States occupies in global politics and the specific relationships, or lack thereof, it has with certain qualified nations. The travel restrictions Iran faced weren't a surprise to anyone. They weren't last-minute complications that nobody could have anticipated. They were foreseeable, predictable consequences of the political relationship between Tehran and Washington. And yet, when the draw was made, when Iran was placed into Group G, no special framework existed to ensure they could prepare under conditions even remotely comparable to their opponents. Some people watching this will say, that's just geopolitics. That's how the world works. You can't expect FIFA to override national security policy. And that's fair to a point. FIFA doesn't control U.S. immigration law. The organization has limited direct authority over what any host nation's government does with entry and visa policy. But FIFA does control the bidding process. FIFA does control the standards it sets for host nations before a World Cup is awarded. And FIFA absolutely controls how loudly it speaks when those conditions are clearly disadvantaging teams that have legitimately qualified for the tournament. The silence from FIFA's formal leadership on Iran's specific preparation challenges throughout this group stage has been notable. When individual player voices, specifically Taremi and Jahan Bakhsh, are the loudest public advocates for their own team's right to basic preparation time, something has gone wrong at the institutional level. Let's come back to that ticket allocation issue for a moment, because I think it deserves more attention than it's received. Iranian supporters had their official ticket allocation revoked days before the tournament started. Think about what that actually means in practice. Fans who had been planning this trip for potentially years, who had booked flights, booked accommodation, taken time off work, made arrangements for families, and then, in the final stretch, their access was pulled. These weren't people trying to cause problems. These were football supporters who wanted to watch their national team compete at a World Cup, which is one of the most fundamental, basic things a football fan can want to do. And that experience was taken away from them, not because of anything they had done, but because of a political dispute between two governments that those individual fans have no control over whatsoever. That's a human cost that's easy to reduce to a line in a controversy summary, but it represents thousands of people whose connection to this tournament was severed through no fault of their own. Now let's bring this back to the match itself, because there's a football argument here that's worth making clearly and directly. Iran didn't just scrape through their group games on luck or circumstance. They were a competitive team. They created chances. They pressed Egypt for long periods. The goal that was disallowed in the 94th minute wasn't the result of a long ball and a lucky bounce. It was the culmination of Iran building sustained pressure in the closing stages of a match where both outcomes were still genuinely possible. The player who was ruled offside, number 4, was in a position that literally 2 of the world feed's experienced commentators described as marginal. Not obvious, not clear-cut. Marginal. The kind of call that, in the era before semi-automated offside technology, would almost certainly have stood. And in the era before VAR, there would have been no review at all, and Iran would have won that match. That's not a criticism of the technology. VAR, semi-automated offside, exists to apply the law as written, and the law as written says any part of a player's body that can legally score a goal, if it's beyond the second-to-last defender at the moment the ball is played, the player is offside. Full stop. The law is the law, and referees don't get to apply it selectively based on context. But there's a broader conversation happening right now in football about whether the law itself needs to evolve. Because right now, we're in a situation where goals that look identical to the human eye, that generate the exact same emotional response in the stadium, that produce the same legitimate seeming celebration from players who believe they've scored, those goals are being separated into valid and invalid by margins measured in centimeters, sometimes literally the angle of a shoulder or a kneecap. Is that the best version of the offside rule for the game? That's a genuine debate that football's governing bodies are going to have to engage with more seriously in the years ahead. Because the accumulation of moments like what Iran experienced, moments where a team that has competed legitimately and created a genuine chance sees its reward removed by a marginal automated measurement, Those moments are starting to create real questions about fan experience, emotional engagement, and whether the technology is serving the spirit of the game or just the letter of it. And this is where Iran's story connects to something much larger than their group stage exit. The 2026 World Cup, in many ways, is a test case. A test of whether FIFA can manage a genuinely politically complex hosting environment without some teams being systematically disadvantaged. A test of whether semi-automated officiating technology has reached the point where its precision is universally accepted as fair, even in its most marginal applications. And a test of whether football's governing bodies are willing to have honest conversations about the gap between the tournament's public messaging and some teams' lived experience. On all three of those tests, the answers coming out of Iran's group stage campaign are complicated. Because here's what we actually know after everything that's happened. Iran qualified legitimately. Iran trained under conditions no other team at this tournament had to manage. Iran lost supporter access through no action of their own. Iran's own players had to publicly advocate for their basic right to timely tournament entry. Iran carried genuine grief from home onto the pitch. And Iran was eliminated ultimately by a margin so fine that the world feed commentators couldn't see it with their own eyes. There are people who will look at all of that and say, the result was still correct, the process was still fair, and football is football. And they're not wrong about any of those individual points. The result was correct under the laws of the game. The process was consistent with how every other match at this tournament has been officiated. Football is football. But there's another reading that's also legitimate, which is that fairness in sport isn't only about whether the referee applied the law correctly in the 94th minute, it's also about whether every team competing had a genuinely equal opportunity to prepare, to be supported by their fans, to focus on football rather than border crossings and visa uncertainty. And on that broader definition of fairness, Iran's World Cup campaign raises questions that a technically correct VAR call can't fully answer. What comes next for Iran is an open question. The federation has signaled clearly throughout this tournament that it's willing to be vocal about the conditions it's faced. Whether that translates into a formal appeal of the match result die, which given the technical correctness of the offside call, would be extremely unlikely to succeed. Or whether it becomes a longer-term case study in how FIFA should approach politically complicated hosting situations in future tournaments, that remains to be seen. What's already clear is that Iran's story from this World Cup is going to be told and retold in the months ahead, not primarily as a story about an offside call, and not primarily as a story about what happened in Group G, but as a story about what it actually looks like when a team competes at the world's biggest sporting event while navigating a set of obstacles that go far, far beyond what happens between the white lines. Football, at its best, has this remarkable ability to transcend the politics around it. Players take the pitch, the ball starts moving, and for 90 minutes, the sport itself becomes the only thing that matters. But Iran's 2026 World Cup experience is a reminder that the world around the sport never fully disappears. It travels with the team. It affects preparation. It shows up in the stands, or in this case, in the absence of supporters who couldn't get in. It weighs on players who are wearing pins for 168 victims back home. And sometimes it shapes how a marginal call in the 94th minute is received, not just by fans watching on screens around the world, but by the people inside that stadium who have been carrying all of it for weeks. That's the story of Iran at the 2026 World Cup. A story that deserved to be told completely, not just in the moment the flag went up. Let me know what you think about all of this in the comments. And if you found this breakdown valuable, subscribe, because this tournament still has a long way to go, and there are going to be more stories like this one before it's over.